I'd like to tell you today about a project that we did in about 1998 in Nashville, Tennessee, at the Temple Ohabi Shalom. At that time, the rabbi of that temple was Rabbi Mark Shifton, who we knew from a previous job we had done for him when he was the rabbi in San Jose. And we had also known Rabbi Shifton through our work at Camp Swig over the summers. We worked with Rabbi Shifton and a small committee on the design for this project. And we wanted it to be a design which was somewhat abstract, and we also wanted it to be somewhat representational. And there was another kind of unique criteria that existed for this design. The congregation of this synagogue loved an old oak tree that grew on the lawn outside the sanctuary windows. And they all enjoyed so much looking at this tree in all the seasons and seeing its leaves and seeing it change color and seeing its branches covered in snow. And for a lot of people in this congregation, it was a spiritual experience to look at this tree, to be in this worship space, and to feel a sense of connection to the universe in that way. What we ended up doing in our design was we left a lot of open space in the upper parts of the composition. What we chose to use for the glass was a type of mouth-blown antique clear glass that had bubbles and small deformities in it that gave it a real crystalline quality. And so when you looked at that tree through this crystalline glass, every time it moved in the wind, it seemed like the whole room was swimming. And it magnified the power of that tree for the people inside of the sanctuary. We also included an abstract element into the composition, and that was a network or grid work of blue squares that makes up the bottom portion of the design. And each one of these blue squares has a white border sandblasted on it as a design element. And it also carries across its whole surface of all of the squares, is carried across the passage, which is the theme of the windows. It's there both in Hebrew and in English, and it translates as all its ways are pleasantness and all its paths are peace, which is the second part of the prayer, which we all know as it is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. So our composition was really about the tree of life, and it was also about the path of peace. So we had this abstract network of blue squares with the text on it at the bottom of the composition, and the upper part of the composition we had a lot of this clear antique glass. And what we then included were, on the sides of the composition, there were a pair of almond trees made up of many, many leaves and many, many almond blossoms. And each one of the almond blossoms had painted on it lines that were like the stamen of an actual almond blossom. And on the end of each one of these lines, on each one of these blossoms, was applied a small dichroic bead, which we had made in our kiln by heating dichroic glass pieces up to a certain temperature, at which point they become spherical. And dichroic glass is a very specialized type of glass that has the property of both reflecting and transmitting light. And in fact, it transmits a different color depending on what angle you look at it. But in our particular case, we were going for the reflective quality of these beads because they will reflect the very smallest amount of light in the sanctuary. So especially at night in this sanctuary, when the lights are out and it's dark outside and the stained glass has gone to black, even with the smallest amount of light, each one of these beads, all 613 of them, will reflect light and glow like a night full of stars. So this was just one of the devices that we used, a very small device, but had a great symbolic power for us. So we now had two trees of life, and the abstract elements that were in the bottom of the composition and the open space. And all we needed now was a path of peace. And we created a path by arranging a circle of 10 large bird-like forms that were soaring and swooping in a large circle across this large wall. So these became the main elements of the design. The clear background pieces that surrounded the trees in this window were created by largely using the glass bandsaw. That is, we had a lot of deep inside curves that we had to cut into these pieces in order to avoid the amateurish technique of creating a lot of additional and extraneous lines in order to make the design executable out of glass. We did a lot of bandsaw and grinder work. And the overall effect of it is kind of awesome because you get a feeling, so much more so, that your design is floating and that your design has a real upward, uplifting effect. And it takes a lot of extra time in the fabrication to achieve that, but the effect of it is subconscious but powerful. And the second thing that I remember, especially from the fabrication of these windows, is that, like many of these large projects, there was a deadline. And the deadline is frequently the high holidays of whatever year we're working in. But for us, the period of time just before the high holidays was always a time that we were up at Camp Swig. That was our month of working and teaching at camp. And in this particular summer, we ended up bringing all of those blue pieces up to Camp Swig and cutting out all the resist and doing all the sandblasting for those pieces late at night in our spare time at Camp Swig. And I think a lot of people from the staff and rabbis who were there at the time stayed up at night with us too, helping us to cut the resist for all of those pieces. Another thing that stands out to me in the job that we did for the temple in Nashville was the installation. Because there were 54 panels, all of them about 4 feet by 4 feet, some were 4 feet by 6 feet, that made up this configuration of openings that created a whole wall of glass that was quite large. And there were 54 of these panels, and each one had to go into an individual opening and be stopped in. And the installation was challenging because the windows were high up on the wall and there was very little clearance. We were working in a space in which the pews were already in the space. The carpet was already laid down, and there was no place to get some real lift equipment in there. So those were some of the challenges of the setup. Fortunately, we were able to get a scissors lift that had an especially narrow clearance in which we were able to get it into the space without damaging the walls or the pews or the carpets. The windows always fit, but sometimes you have to make changes to them on the job site in order to make them fit. In this case, each one of the 54 panels needed to be modified in its dimension in both sides in order for it to fit into the opening. And that was a step that we didn't anticipate, and a step that slowed us down quite a bit and stretched out the length of the installation quite a bit. No one would know all of that additional effort that had been necessary just to get the panels to fit.